Hot Take Hockey Podcast with your hosts, Lucas and John Viveiros.
All right, so we're excited to welcome another guest join us here on the Hot Take Hockey Podcast. You've seen him through his various work on Sportsnet as a fantasy hockey analyst, as well as a radio host on Sportsnet 590 The Fan. Additionally, you can catch him on the NHL Fantasy on Ice podcast, which has numerous episodes dropped weekly on all your podcast streaming platforms. We're pleased to welcome Nick Alberga. How's it going, Nick?
Legend. Fantastic. A man of many titles. And I didn't realize I was coming on a podcast with Matt Molson and Marc-Andre Fleury. So this is my pleasure, fellas. What's going on?
Awesome. Love to hear it. We love it. Listen, man, we just want to jump right into it. Pick your brain on some different fantasy topics here. Let's start with, let's start with some dark horse teams. Give us a couple teams that you got that you're watching this year and you see some potential there.
Yeah, it's funny, guys. Even when you look at sort of this offseason in general, there's been a lot of wheeling and dealing. Not that it doesn't happen every year, but I think this year more than others. And it's funny because sort of a flat cap program still, at least for the next couple of years until things really expand exponentially. I think to answer your question, I think a lot of people are curious by the Calgary Flames, what their decisions and what their changes mean long-term, not just in fantasy, but in reality. I like the new composition of that team, so I'm intrigued by them. I actually think they're a better team than they were. The Ottawa Senators, I think, are front and center too, considering sort of the offseason they had. You bring in DeBrincat, you bring in Cam Talbot, Matt Murray, Connor Brown, among others, out of the mix. There's just so much more depth. Like, I expect Tim Stützle to take another step this season. Thomas Chabot as well. Claude Giroux's in the mix from Hearst, Ontario. Like, there's a lot of reasons why people should be excited by Ottawa, but I'm sort of tempering expectations. But I think from a fantasy perspective, a lot of people are going to be horny about the Ottawa Senators. People are going to be after them. I don't know. I'm just going to sit back and relax and wait a bit on them.
Me too.
I think in general with that Atlantic Division, Detroit's a team of interest too, with like Perron in the mix, Andrew Kopp, Kubalik, Ben Sherratt coming in, Ville Husso. Like, there's a lot more options from that perspective. Before the Pacioretty injury, I probably would have said that Carolina won the offseason. I'm always careful to say that on paper because, again, you got to have to play the games. But I like the Burns pickup. I like the Kasha pickup. Dylan Coughlin's a sneaky under the radar pickup from Vegas in the Pacioretty deal. But Pacioretty's going to be out for a significant chunk of the season. So what does that mean for like a guy like Jesperi Kotkaniemi, right? And also Anthony DeAngelo leaving. Like, there's a lot more questions, but I think those are sort of the teams I would look at to maybe take another step this season.
Overall, I'm curious just on your perspective. NHL fantasy is a lot more obviously the games mean a lot more in football. So for NHL fantasy, I'm just kind of curious on your perspective because I feel like in football fantasy, a guy gets hurt, you're picking up the next guy up on waivers. For the NHL, like, I'm looking at a scenario where the Capitals, you're starting the year, no Tom Wilson, no Backstrom. Are you on the wave of recommending like people to pick up like a Connor Brown or a Dylan Strome later in the draft? Like, that's just one example, but just kind of on that mentality, would that be advice for you from you for people?
Yeah, definitely. I think I know what you're asking. Like, let's say running back goes down in football. Who do you pick up? Is it the person who's going to succeed him? And I think more times than not, I think you have to give them a legitimate look. I think early in the season, there's going to be a lot more options, but not to give away too much. My top 10 sleepers are coming out on sportsnet.ca on Friday, and Connor Brown is on that list for a variety of reasons. You guys know I love contract years too. He's in a contract year, can walk after this season. I just think there's a lot of value with potentially playing with Kuznetsov and Ovechkin on that top line. So I will be looking. I just wanted to add too that like lists in general are so subjective. I know people just want to shit on each other for lists. Like, I just think it's the funniest thing ever that people get so hung on these lists. I think lists are meant for interpretation and debate. So like, if NHL.com wants to do their thing, I'll do my own thing at Sportsnet, The Athletic, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's a lot of great, useful information. So I think that's the biggest piece of advice I would give to people playing fantasy is like, lists are subjective, but don't make them your only basis for information and knowledge. Like, go to everybody and check a bit. But yeah, that's probably the way I would answer that question. I think you have to have that approach when it comes to filling in for guys who are injured or not playing right now.
Yeah, sorry, that was a bit all over the place, but I like what you said because like even for myself making content, people are always like telling me I'm wrong on my predictions. It's like, buddy, it hasn't happened yet. Like, I can't be wrong on a prediction when it hasn't. So it's just, if
you have the formula and the data, you can tell me right now what's going to happen this season.
Yeah. There you go. Exactly. Yeah. So it's definitely, I like what you said on it's very subjective for sure.
Yeah, I liked you focusing in on those Atlantic teams at the start. And it's
Mhm.
weird. Everywhere you go, I hear different things about, is the Atlantic weaker this year? But most people say it's stronger from a depth standpoint when you have the Ottawa Senators coming up, Detroit Red Wings, Buffalo Sabres even taking a few steps. I can see that happening this year. How do you see the Atlantic shaping out? And are the Leafs truly the favorite of that division? Or, is Florida, Tampa still really going to push that top end?
I think we're at a point in the Atlantic. It's like, who wants it, right?
Mhm.
I think Florida sacrificed, some regular season success to be a better and harder team to play against in the Stanley Cup playoffs. And I think some of their pickups would show that, namely Matthew Tkachuk. I think I have some serious questions when it comes to Toronto's goaltending, whether it be Matt Murray or Ilya Samsonov or anybody else that they've tried over the last 10, 15 years. I think you look at Tampa, they're also a team who could get by coasting. And by coasting, I mean still posting a 100-point season, but not really going after the jugular in a President's Trophy. I think there is opportunity for, say, like an Ottawa to get in there if 4 teams we think are coming out of the Atlantic and 4 in the Metro. I just think there's a lot of uncovered depth, if you will, in the Metro that I think Ottawa is going to be jockeying with the likes of, say like a Boston. And I do still think, despite all the injuries, that Boston's going to be a better team than people are giving them credit for. I think they got to buy time till some of their guys come back, namely Brad Marchand, who could be back, mid to late November. But I think they've done enough in recent memory to prove that, hey, we've got enough talent to create time and then to buy time until these guys are ready to go. So I think ultimately, I think these teams are improved. I think it's going to be harder to play against any team you play against in the Atlantic Division, but I don't foresee a big significant shift in sort of the standings in the division. I think what's happened is that Ottawa and Detroit specifically have closed the gap. I still think Buffalo is not great. I think Montreal is a retooling team. I think they're going to be hard to play against, but I think teams have closed the gap, but I'm not there yet to say that Ottawa is going to beat any one of those 3 teams. Maybe a Boston.
Yeah, jumping in on Boston too. I know, I really liked their goaltending tandem last year, especially Swayman near the end of the year. I mean, he really helped me improve tremendous value for me in fantasy. Yeah. Brad Marchand's got to be one you circle and hope he drops to you. I don't know if that's going to be in the 60s, 70s later on, because that's big value there when he comes back. Exactly, John.
Yeah, I've been doing, we've done now 2 mock drafts over at the NHL Fantasy on Ice podcast. We're doing a 3rd next week that'll be streamed live on YouTube, by the way. And I think it's a 8-team draft. Normally we've been doing 10-team drafts. And I can tell you that, and I have Marchand, I believe, at sportsnet.ca, my top 250. I have him around 70 or 71, I want to say. Okay. So I have him in the wave, like just before Kevin Fiala. I think there's more value in drafting a Brad Marchand than, drafting a Kevin Fiala who's had like consistency issues throughout his career. I think he's coming off a really good season with Minnesota. I'm still curious to see how he fits with the Los Angeles Kings, assuming, he skates with Anze Kopitar on that top line. But that's probably where I would slot Marchand in, because obviously there's the sex appeal of a guy who is a bona fide top 10 fantasy player still. And he's going to miss a month and a half to 2 months. I think you take that value. So around the 70 mark is where I'll tell you he's likely going to go in your draft.
Yeah, I've always said, like, if you're confident in your drafting abilities and you're going to be able to make the playoffs, like sacrificing 1 pick there to get a guy that's going to get you over the top in the final rounds. But I like the conversation of Allmark Swayman, because I hate to be a guy, and maybe you feel this, Nick, is like when I'm making content about fantasy, is like for the money leagues that I'm in, giving away my recipe for success. Yeah. And just one strategy I've been kind of looking over is just, instead of maybe drafting the solo guys, the go-to guys like a Vasilevsky, Shesterkin, whoever it is on the top end, do you see a scenario that works out where you can go a different route? So you're seeing Colorado, the tandem of Georgiev, Francouz, the Toronto tandem, Murray, Samsonov, and even the Boston tandem, Allmark Swayman, drafting both guys out of the tandem later in the draft. So you're securing all the games out of that team. And for Colorado, like if you get both Georgiev and Francouz later in the draft, then you're getting all those Colorado wins. Do you kind of see a scenario there as a strategy?
Yeah. So in the fantasy world, as you know, we sort of call that handcuffing a tandem. Now, I think it's a tactic. It's certainly a strategy that's been implemented the last couple of years, certainly in this tandem timeshare type era that we live in. Like, gone are the days where you're drafting Martin Brodeur and he's playing 70 games a year. Like, it just doesn't happen. And by the year, we're losing guys left and right who are just bona fide stud number ones. And I think that's why you're seeing guys like Shesterkin and Vasilevsky as perennial first rounders, I think, for the first time in terms of goaltenders in a long period of time. I just think when it comes to goaltending, it's all subjective on how a draft goes, right? Like, the impending goalie run, what does that mean for your roster? I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. Like, more times than not, I like to go with depth as opposed to like two guys in between the pipes. So that makes sense. So I think your best strategy, thinking that along the lines, if you're in a 12-team non-keeper league format, for example, handcuffing, a Colorado tandem of Georgiev and Francouz isn't the worst idea. And then you have a third goalie, or you have an upper echelon goalie like a Saros. Like, I think, to answer your question, you'll be able to find and extract a lot of value. And I think when it comes to the goaltending position, after say like the top 10 or 12, that's where I think you're going to find your value, where every year it seems like there's a couple guys who go outside the top 10, top 15, who actually turn into studs for your team. So that's what you're looking for in your draft right now.
Yeah, that was for me. I got Jari and Markstrom so late in last year's draft,
Exactly.
and I was just laughing. I was like,
Yeah.
I can't believe this, especially Markstrom. I was like, man, I don't know why people aren't looking at the games Markstrom's going to put up. And then obviously Jari was just kind of a sense that he was going to bounce back. But yeah, just overall, I don't know. I think fantasy is going to be exciting this year. I just think with all the, as you said, all the big moves. Lucas,
and in the goaltending, I just find you're bang on, Nick, when it comes to the elite upper echelon goaltenders. I find there's just such a steep drop after a couple of them that I'm almost wavering on, and I've never been a huge fan of him in fantasy, but a guy like Connor Hellebuck, who is going to get the majority of the starts easily in Winnipeg, but I'm just not that high on the Jets. And so I wouldn't put my eggs in the basket to get Connor Hellebuck. What's your outlook on the Jets? I mean, Blake Wheeler, obviously the whole captaincy situation there. Do you see a scenario where you're targeting Winnipeg Jets for your team?
I'm going to live by Winnipeg and die by Winnipeg this season. So yeah, similar to Jacob Markstrom, I was all over Markstrom last year in my fantasy draft, and obviously that hit. Hellebuck is the same type of conversation. Like, I think it's easy to forget, but he's 2 years removed from a Vezina trophy. Like, we're talking elite company, right? And I just think you look at Winnipeg in general, it's quite clear they have not been the same team since the Mark Scheifele hit on Jake Evans in the playoffs a couple of years ago. Like, they haven't. And obviously I think, further proof in the pudding that they stripped Blake Wheeler of the captaincy, and I think the writing is on the wall there. So I'm a bit more hesitant to maybe look at Wheeler in fantasy drafts, although I think I expect a bounce back for him. Like, across the board, Nikolai Ehlers, Connor Hellebuck, I think to an extent, anybody on the back end, Neil Pionk. Like, I think Winnipeg at the very least is going to be tougher to play against. And I just think you look at the body of work, for Rick Bowness, what he did with the Dallas Stars, namely with the younger players, Cole Perfetti. You talk about rookies who could have sort of a breakout season, maybe potentially be in the Calder conversation. There's a plum assignment available for Perfetti on that top line for the Winnipeg Jets. So I actually think there's believe it or not, a lot of value with Winnipeg this season. But again, it all depends on how you feel about a team. Like, I'm probably in a small community who likes Vancouver this season, and I like Winnipeg to surprise some people. I just think goaltending is so big. And I just think you look at the body of work specifically with Hellebuck and also Rick Bowness and the way his teams play defense, that I think there's going to be a lot of value to extract there.
Yeah, you mentioned Vancouver there. I think two guys that you could obviously lock in for a lot of games is Hellebuck and Demko. So
yeah, I
think that will be kind of an intriguing aspect there. I think there's just always quite a few guys that I think people have that kind of, I don't know, just that narrow-minded, this previous year. And look 2 years ago. I mean, Hellebuck's a perfect example, but another guy that's a perfect example for me is Matt Barzal. I think you just look at last year and just forget Barzal's skill and forget his potential. I'm looking at Barzal, and he's probably going to fall in so many drafts, and I don't want to give my recipe for success away here, but I'll definitely, a few of these guys I got in mind, I'll definitely be looking at. But is there a guy like a Barzal for you up front that didn't have the greatest season that you feel like is going to fall in drafts and probably explode?
So this is a good tee up again for another article that's coming up this week on sportsnet.ca, top 10 list of bounce back candidates. And I should preface by saying I was all over Nazem Kadri last season. I got him 185, 190 in my keeper. And I think I had 3 different leagues. I grabbed Kadri. I love contract years to begin with. And I just felt there was value and attachment clearly to the big boys there. And he was outstanding, right? Anthony DeAngelo is another guy. So to answer your question, And I guess, because I put out information, I just deal with that. I'm in a league with my buddies, and they're just, whether they're going to admit it or not, they're going to look at what I put out there, and it is what it is. And they're probably going to identify and target guys that I might go after. And it's the nature of the ball game when you're in this position, right?
Yeah.
So I will give some names. I won't give them all because I want people to read my article coming up on Friday, but Connor Hellebuck's one of them. The guy I'm really, really interested, aside from Barzal, who is on my list, by the way. I think it's important to know too, with centers, they keep dropping because there's a lot of depth when it comes to centers. Sure. I've seen in my mock draft so far, guys, that, the likes of Patrice Bergeron, Nazem Kadri, Matthew Barzal have been slipping. So just be cognizant of that. But the big name I will give you that I am all over this season is Dougie Hamilton of the New Jersey Devils.
Yeah.
It's a recency bias type conversation because last year the guy couldn't stay healthy. But I think you look more internally at the numbers. He had 20 points, 7 goals in the first 30 games of the season. And then I believe, he broke his jaw and, he hurt his toe and he just wasn't the same. And then on top of that, we think New Jersey's going to be a better team. I think Vitek Vanacek's going to help solidify. You want to talk about bounce back candidates. Mackenzie Blackwood is another guy I may be targeting this season at some point in time. Jack Hughes, another year of him. Like they bring in Palat. Like you start to be reinvigorated a bit with the New Jersey Devils. And I just think I look at Dougie Hamilton. I look at his body of work. The guy loves shooting the puck. He loves scoring goals. Like he's always a guy who's always in the conversation for the higher scoring defenseman that I just think there's just so much value. Like in doing the mock drafts, like the guys over at NHL and the women as well with Anna Dua, they have Dougie Hamilton slotted, I believe 120, 130, 140. Where you look at my rankings, I have him 81. And again, it's all subjective on how you feel about a player. And I'm forecasting a bounce back season for Dougie Hamilton, assuming he can stay healthy. I just think there's just so much value. And he's just the type of player I'm ready to jump on in my draft ahead of other people, if that makes sense.
Nick, man, we might have to take this, like another guy where I was like, I'm looking at him this draft and I'm like, man, he's slipping. And funny enough, big shout out to Anna, went to school with her. So legend as well.
Best. There you go.
I have to bring her on the pod, but yeah. So it's interesting. Yeah. On the conversation of the Devils. Cause I just think attaching the Devils to some of these guys, people just might let a Jack Hughes or a Dougie Hamilton fall through the ranks because of their position in the standings. Potentially. I wouldn't sleep on the Devils, but again, the Metro Division, a tough spot. But also on the conversation, I want to throw this to Lucas as well. Do you feel like, so I know we kind of already touched on the goaltending, but so in a situation where like the Leafs tandem is such a question mark, do you feel like that plays into your mind as well? Like maybe a guy that is not necessarily, I don't know, the most skilled or a great player, but just in a great scenario. So, I mean, a Michael Bunting would be another guy where it's like, he will probably slip, but a guy might pick Bunting because he's with two of the best players in the world. So is that kind of a mindset for you? I mean, Lucas, I know you were saying you're going to stay away from Samsonov and Murray probably, but you also have the Leaf bias a bit.
Yeah. As far as Samsonov and Murray goes, I need to see it before I can, get all over that. I feel like I know the Leafs are going to do pretty well this season. I'm confident in that, but I'm not confident in those two goaltenders and having good numbers at this point. But Bunting, that's a great point right there, because I wanted to transition into players like that. So Nick, what do you think about guys like Bunting, like Hyman, guys that are strapped to elite players that are probably good for 55 plus points?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Like the other name I'd bring up was like, who's going to be the number one center for the Columbus Blue Jackets, right? Yep. Would it be a Cole Sillinger? Would it be a Boone Jenner? I think to that point, as a fantasy owner, you have to think outside the box of who's going to bring me the most bang for my buck or the most value. Like Michael Bunting was also on my list of top 10, rookies. Not to pat myself on the back for everything I hit, for everything, I didn't hit last season as well. It's important to bring those names up too. But like those type of players where you're going to draft them later on in your draft, but they're just going to get you 55 to 60 points, maybe 20 goals. And they're oftentimes like players like nobody is really thinking about. Like I'm really, really high on Tyler Toffoli this season with Calgary because he's going to play, more times than not, you would think at least in the top 6, but more specifically with Elias Lindholm and Jonathan Huberdeau. I just think that's a plum assignment. So I like to call them plum assignments where guys are set up for success. And, sometimes it could be a veteran like Connor Brown, who's I guess not really a veteran, but, midpoint of his career,
been around, yep.
Or guys like Cole Sillinger who are really, really young. Evan Bouchard's another guy who I'm projecting maybe a 50+ point
Evan
season
Bouchard, baby.
Oh, Luke's
Yeah,
been
from
calling
Oakville.
that
There you
one.
go.
It's gonna happen.
Yeah, no, there's guys like that. Like, again, I always like to say, you will find value in your fantasy draft. It's just about, hitting, X amount of players that will bring your team past others. So that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to get into a little bit of a rapid fire later on in this pod and just give you, two guys and see which way you would go. And I tried to pick guys that have sort of a connection to each other. But before we get into that, I guess we can open up the conversation like this. I'm sitting in the 4th spot in my fantasy draft, and I had asked a previous guest about this. I'm sitting in the 4th spot, so I foresee it as McDavid, Draisaitl, Matthews are going to go out in the top 3. That's how I foresee it now. I mean, someone could throw a curveball and pick someone ahead of those 3, but that's how I see it going down. So in my 4th spot, if I'm deciding between Nathan MacKinnon and Cale Makar, what says you?
Who was your previous guest? That's my question.
Our previous guest was Luca from Bar Down.
Okay, yeah, the Italian stallion, yeah. See, that's been the big thing for me. I'm just always really, really hesitant to, number 1, grab goalies in my first round, and number 2, grab defensemen.
Yeah,
taking nothing away from Cale Makar, he won pretty much every award, but the guy won a Stanley Cup. Like, has he hit his peak? If that makes sense, will the motivation be there to start the season? Will there be an injury?
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's more of a surefire thing to go with a forward. And I have Nathan MacKinnon. I think people are sleeping on him. I know he's going to get a big fat extension, I think, in the next couple of weeks, but I just think in terms of value, in terms of potential, there's a reason why a NHL defenseman hasn't hit the 100-point plateau in 30 years, right? I think 92, Brian Leetch is the last time.
Yep.
It's hard. It's really, really hard to do. And I still think Cale Makar is going to have an outstanding season, but when push comes to shove and we're talking at the end of the fantasy season, I just don't think it's going to say like 4 or 5 beside his name, if that makes sense. So I would go MacKinnon. I would go a couple guys ahead of Makar. In fact, I would go MacKinnon, Kaprizov, Kucherov, Rantanen. Wow. I have Makar around 8, but that's just me. I know people are hot and heavy and fired up with Makar and the way his season went last year, but I just think you have to tread carefully. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, I think a lot of it from me, sorry, John, a lot of it from me just comes from players I love to watch on a nightly basis. Yeah. And Makar is obviously one of those guys. So I have that bias. Jack Hughes is one of those guys who slid to me last season. So I was able to pick him in a pretty good spot. But okay, I want to do this quick rapid fire.
Sure.
Give you a few players. You let me know who you're going to go with. All right, we're going to go first with 2 guys who have Leaf connections. You're going to go with Nazem Kadri or John Tavares?
I'm going to go John Tavares. I think it's unrealistic to expect Nazem Kadri to have the year he did last year in his contract year. I think he's going to be good for the Calgary Flames, but don't forget, again, he's not the number 1 C. It's Elias Lindholm. I don't know if the attachment's going to be there to Johnny Huberdeau. And I just think, you talk about disrespected fantasy players. I think John Tavares is in that conversation, and maybe it's just because of how polarizing he is, who he plays for. But this guy's a surefire, like 30-goal point per game type guy. And then you just look at the attachment. So to me, it would be John Tavares.
Good to know. All right, Elias Lindholm or Johnny Gaudreau?
I'll go Johnny Gaudreau, although I will say that I don't think he's going to match what he did last season. Would he have 115 points or so with the Calgary Flames? I still have serious doubts with Columbus. We just talked about it. Like, Elias Lindholm, last time I checked, is not in Columbus. So, Johnny's playing with Cole Sillinger or Boone Jenner or, somebody like that, who's just not going to be the same type of center. And I think that's a vital position. And then you never know what kind of Patrick Laine you're going to get. So I'll still say Johnny Gaudreau. I think obviously because there's a lot of center depth in fantasy hockey that I can wait and probably see if some of these guys will slip. So I'll go with Johnny Hockey.
Okay. Keep it on with the Canadian theme. Jack Campbell or Alex Georgiev?
Ooh, you guys probably know how high I'm on Georgiev. I think he's going to be the number 1 with Colorado. I'm still not sold that Jack Campbell can be a number 1 goalie in this league. Like I just don't know if he has the mentality to win a Stanley Cup. And again, you can make that conversation for a lot of goalies. I think it's close, but I'll go with Jack Campbell just because there's minimal resistance, we'll say, in Stuart Skinner as the backup, in my opinion.
Okay, and I got one more for you on the Canadian theme: Cole Caulfield or Claude Giroux?
I'm going to go Cole Caulfield, and definitive at that.
Yep.
I'm expecting big things. I think he had 22 tucks in 35 games under Martin St. Louis. Could have been 37 games, but you get the point. Like, that's a 40-goal clip. I think Caulfield's going to be a monster this season. I think Claude Giroux's a really, really good player, but like, he's not on Florida anymore. I know he's ripping it up in the top 6 in Florida, but it's a different team. There's expectations, lofty ones at that, and I think he's going to settle into sort of a depth scoring. Maybe that's an unfair term, but like, they got some guys who can put the puck in the net, and Giroux's not going to be a go-to factor. So that's a simple one for me. It's Cole Caulfield.
Got it. I'm happy I got you thinking on a couple of those ones.
Yeah, man, Lucas, yeah. I'm loving it. I was gonna say on the previous conversation of taking forwards early. I hope you wouldn't give me too much shit, Nick, if as the reigning sport media champ, I'm default to that 12 spot. And I'm like, there's been a couple times I'm looking at the 12-13 spot, and man, Fox and Hedman back to back and just solidifying that defense. It's a little bit of a hot take, but
no, I like it. And again, I am open to every conversation. Like, that's just my ideology. And that's why, I always get questions, via social media or whatever, people asking me, what should I do with my keeper teams? Like, it's all how you feel. Like, yeah, I'm there to give advice, and that's part of my role in this industry, but it's also like, I love snake drafts, and I like being that 12 to 13 mark. Like, I think you can find so much value, and more times than not, you get a couple guys that slip. Like, I did a mock draft 2.0, where I got Mitch Marner like 14 or 15, and I'm like, sure, I'll take him. And then everybody's like, oh, you're a Leafs fan. I'm like, well, not really. I'll take the value where I can get it. I really don't care what team the player plays on. So yeah, I know what you're saying. And, I would just add, I've been really, really successful in fantasy leagues over the year. But I have a tough time taking defensemen really high. I always have been that way.
Yeah.
I think it's more so because I've been able to find unbelievable value late in the draft on defensemen. This year, Jake Sanderson comes to mind, Adam Boakfist, like those type of guys who I know I can peak around 150, 160, 170 and find that value. But I think I might evolve my strategy a bit more this year in my drafts, where I might take a look at, an elite defenseman earlier on, because again, I've struggled with that in the past, especially when you're looking at you see list your stud at 23, 24, like JT Miller or Svechnikov, and it's like a decision between him and Yossi or Hedman. I don't know. I always have injuries in my mind when it comes to defensemen, because they play such taxing minutes. But again, nobody's wrong in this scenario.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, as you said, subjective. I think for myself, I think it's probably a bias for me, because the couple times I've won, it's I had such a solid defense group. Like last year I won, I had Yossi, Carlson, Riley, and Letang. And for me, that worked really well. So yeah, overall, just last conversation or last question, and Lucas, I'll throw it to you and we can close it out, is first round, would you touch Crosby or Ovi later in the first round? Do you think there's still gonna be production? And obviously the health conversation as both of them get older.
No, short answer would be no. I have Crosby at 15. I have Ovechkin at 16. There's just a multitude of players before. I have Stamkos at 14. Jonathan Huberdeau, I think, is going to bring some extreme value again. Love Barkov. Then you get into the goalie conversation with Vasi and Shesterkin, Mitch Marner. There's just, to answer that, I think there's just too many quality players ahead of those two guys. I still think they're unbelievable fantasy talents, but I think there's better players in front of them.
Fair enough. I mean, I'm just thinking, if Ovi stays healthy, still locking in the goals as extra fantasy points, to me as that 12 and 13 spot, I had the same situation last year. I'm just there's so many options at that ranked spot, and going back to back, it's going to be tough.
Yeah. The thing that drives me nuts is we know Ovi misses games, and he always misses games in the fantasy playoffs, right? So it's great in the regular season. You get to the end of the year, they rest him, and he doesn't play the most meaningful hockey for you. That's why he's the type of, it's weird to say, because he's probably the best goal scorer of all time. Not even probably, in my opinion. And I never draft him in fantasy hockey. I never have. There, as you guys mentioned earlier, there's always a type of players that you're really high on, and there's the ones that you, for some reason or another, always stay away from. And for some reason, Ovechkin, I never get ownership of him for some reason.
Yeah, and Sid makes me a bit nervous too. Just as he's getting older, it makes me so nervous him getting injured towards the end of the year.
That's why Sid was money in the bank last year, just because he fell with the injury at the start of the season. So, but I think I'm staying away this year. All right, Nick. Well, we really appreciate you coming on, man. I want to shout out your Twitter, Golden Muzzy.
Yes, you got it right. I would just add too, like if you're looking for value, some injury guys who could come back at some point. We heard the news on Sean Couturier, probably not him. Like if you can stash some of these guys, Max Pacioretty, Tom Wilson, Anthony Duclair, guys like that, I think you can find a lot of value. But to tee myself up at the Golden Muzzy on social media, and just doing a bunch of stuff with the NHL and fantasy, and a bit with Sportsnet too.
Yeah, and check out Nick's articles on Sportsnet to get ready for the fantasy season. It's coming. We're only a few weeks away.
What a legend for coming on the HCH pod. I appreciate it, man.
Thanks a lot,
man. My pleasure,
really
guys. Thanks for having me.
The Muzzy's looking stellar.
Oh, buddy. Tom Selleck, baby.
I might give you a run in November. We'll see. I'll send you a picture in November.
Let's do it.
All righty. Take care, man.
Thanks again, Nick.
Thanks a lot.